Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. It has been a while since the turmoil in my life finally settled, and I can now share the full account of what happened when I mustered the courage to divorce my ex-wife. I'm well aware that this tale may appear one-sided, but it's essential to understand the events leading up to our divorce to grasp the gravity of the situation. In the beginning, she portrayed herself as an entirely different person, someone fragile and timid, and I found solace in taking care of her. She shared tales of her troubled past, claiming her parents were addicts, forcing her to forge her own path from a young age. Little did I know it was all a facade. After tying the knot, her true colors began to surface. I discovered her parents were not addicts. They had distanced themselves from her due to her history of stealing money for her own vices. The gentle and meek woman I fell in love with transformed into an aggressive and demanding person, unleashing verbal tirades whenever things didn't go her way. To my utter dismay, I uncovered her infidelity, as she had betrayed our vows with multiple men. Realizing that a happy life was unattainable under such circumstances, I decided to divorce her. However, even the process of separation proved to be an arduous battle. Before our marriage, she had moved into my house, but the duration of our union was too brief to warrant her inclusion on the property's paperwork. Consequently, the deed solely bore my name. Initially, she seemed relatively accepting of the divorce, but as I would soon discover, she had no intentions of making it easy. At one point, she cunningly called the police while I was in another room, accusing me of trespassing on her property. Sadly, the flawed justice system weaves a narrative where the party that makes the call is often deemed in the right, regardless of the truth. The officers, without entertaining my side of the story, forcibly removed me from my own house, treating it as an eviction. Unjustly detained at the police station, I spent hours providing statements, but my pleas fell on deaf ears. They operated under the misguided assumption that the house would naturally belong to the divorced woman. To avoid any further legal trouble, I sought temporary refuge with a friend while I contacted my divorce lawyer. I informed him of the situation, emphasizing that she had effectively evicted me from my rightful abode, denying me access to my personal belongings. Recognizing that the house was undeniably mine, he advised me to bide my time until our scheduled meeting, where all parties involved could address this matter in one fell swoop. As I arrived at the appointed meeting, my ex-wife sat beside her lawyer, seemingly confident. Tempted to unleash my pent-up frustration, I heeded my lawyer's counsel and remained composed, allowing our legal representatives to do the talking. Her lawyer presented an outlandish list of demands, including my stamp collection, valued at over $100,000, which had no legal connection to her. When the topic of the house arose, my lawyer posed a direct question to her, asking if she was living in the house alone because I had left of my own volition. Seizing the opportunity, her lawyer claimed she should receive the house due to my alleged abandonment. To support her falsehood, she confidently echoed his statement. However, that precise moment became her downfall. My lawyer produced police reports from the day I was wrongfully removed from the house, revealing her false claim of ownership and my supposed trespassing. She faltered, whispering anxiously to her attorney, who then resorted to the typical argument that the house should go to the wife in such situations. But my lawyer, well prepared and armed with knowledge of the law, countered his baseless assertion. He presented irrefutable evidence that she had no legal claim to the house. Her name was absent from the deed, she hadn't made any payments toward it, and the duration of her cohabitation fell short of the time frame required to establish rights to the property. Instead, my lawyer exposed her unlawful actions, highlighting how she had attempted to deceive authorities and steal my home under false pretenses. The room fell silent as my lawyer turned to me, revealing that, under the law, I had every right to press charges against her. It might have been a slightly petty move, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to hold her accountable for her actions. With a resolute voice, I confirmed my decision to proceed with legal prosecution, charging her with attempted theft of my house and providing false information to the authorities. Suddenly the tide turned, and the police, who had previously disregarded my claims, shifted their stance, now inclined to believe in my ownership of the property. My ex-wife faced a separate court hearing concerning the house, which was a blessing in disguise. In the interim period between the two legal proceedings, she stubbornly refused to vacate the premises, blatantly disregarding the judge's orders. However, her insolence was short-lived. When confronted by the judge, she unleashed a torrent of verbal abuse, showing complete disdain for the court. Her contemptuous behavior backfired spectacularly as the judge decided to impose a severe sentence, sentencing her to jail for her contempt of court and violation of multiple laws. Admittedly, the feeling of pride didn't entirely encapsulate my emotions when the final verdict was reached. However, I reveled in the knowledge that justice had prevailed, bringing closure to this turbulent chapter of my life. I'm now relishing my newfound freedom, approaching life with a renewed perspective, and vowing to scrutinize the true nature of individuals before becoming deeply involved. A friend kindly collected my ex-wife's belongings from the house, and I hope that with the weight of her actions behind us, she will never darken the doorstep of my cherished home again. The next one is a pro-revenge story. Years ago, I used to work with a receptionist in a vet clinic named Margot. Margot was, and still is, a very sweet 65-year-old woman who had been at this practice since it was opened some 40 years ago. She always had a smile, a joke, compliments, and baked goods for your birthday. She never had an unkind word to say about anyone. She was seriously one of the coolest people I had ever worked with, and she basically knew everyone, from our regular clients to our mailman's granddaughter. The only bad thing about Margot, and this was not her fault, was that she and her family lived next to one of the trashiest, nastiest families I had ever met that had two even nastier pit bulls. I'm talking nastier than crap that had been hoarded by dung beetles for years nasty. And these dogs were constantly escaping and terrorizing the neighborhood, even trying to get into her house. Margot had asked them more than once to please keep the dogs contained, especially since she had an elderly, fat cat named Smokestack, and these pits had attacked smaller animals before. The family basically told her to rot in hell, that they knew what they were doing. How dare she accuse the breed? Yada yada, basically blowing her off. Margot knew there had been reports filed against her neighbors, but nothing had ever been done about it, really. So she made sure to keep Smokestack in the house to keep him safe and was very careful not to let him out. If you had been paying attention up until this point, you'll notice I'm using the words was and had regarding old Smokestack, and it was as awful as you think. 3 weeks before Christmas, Margot had the day off and was in the garage with Smokestack fiddling with some Christmas decorations. Unbeknownst to her, the pits next door got out and broke through the bottom of her garage door. They went right for Smokestack before she could blink and started tearing the cat apart. Margot screamed for help, and it was only when her son and husband came out with a baseball bat that they were able to free Smokestack from the jaws of these dogs. I was working that day, and will never forget when she came in, crying harder than I had ever seen anyone cry in my life, clutching poor dying Smokestack in her arms. Her husband had to hold her while we tried to bring Smokestack back, but we couldn't do it. It would have taken a miracle of God and then some, and he passed away. A truly crap way to go in what should have been the golden years of his fat cat life. Margot sat there for a while with his mangled body, quietly crying for a while, before she finally kissed whatever part of him was still intact and stood up. She told us all, "I've got a job to do, take care of him, girls," and then left. We figured Margot would take a few days off to be with family and then continue on with life as normal. We figured wrong. Now when I say Margot knew everyone, I mean everyone. Right after she left the hospital, Margot gathered herself up and went to the police with pictures of poor Smokestack and told her story. The same police officers she had watched grow up over the last 20 years, from rowdy middle schoolers she used to help babysit to the officers they were today. They were absolutely shocked to hear what had happened to their surrogate grandma, and pushed her case to the front of the line. The case found itself before a judge whose daughter had gone to school with Margot's daughter. The judge granted an emergency dangerous animal extraction warrant to her neighbors. Of course, there was a hearing. Within 2 weeks, which I gotta admit was ridiculously fast. The neighbors tried to argue that their dogs weren't aggressive. They even went so far as to accuse Margot of having it out for their family and making it all up. But their argument crumbled when the dozens of dangerous animal reports were presented, and finally completely fell apart when Margot presented the surveillance video her grandson had obtained, showing the dogs entering her property and attacking poor Smokestack. The emergency extraction and humane destruction of her neighbor's dogs were granted. It was Christmas Eve when Margot heard a knock on her door. She opened it to see the neighbors standing there, sobbing uncontrollably. They were begging her to stop animal control, saying that they had owned these dogs since they were puppies, how the kids would be devastated, and it would ruin Christmas. They pleaded with her to find it in her heart to give the dogs another chance. Up until this moment, the neighbors had behaved abominably. They didn't offer to fix the garage. They never apologized for trying to slander her name in court. Hell, they didn't even pay for Smokestack's cremation. At no point had they even shown the slightest shred of remorse for the damage their dogs had done. And as the neighbors stood there, blubbering and whimpering about how this was going to ruin their Christmas, Margot looked them straight in the eye and told them, in her calmest voice, "You took away my family, so now I'm taking yours." And she shut the door in their faces, just as animal control pulled up into the driveway. Margot was not surprised as she watched the dogs get hauled into the truck and taken away. After all, it was her idea for animal control to take the dogs on Christmas Eve, a perk from having known the AC officer supervisor for years. Margot even made sure the dogs were euthanized before the outside Christmas lights turned on that night. The family never received the remains, nor did they ever get a chance to bring another animal into their family, as the father proceeded to drunk drive into a telephone pole that same night, killing him instantly. The mother went off the deep end, so CPS picked up the kids by February, and ultimately the house foreclosed in September. Despite how traumatic Smokestack's death was, I'd like to think that if the neighbors had shown at least some regret, Margot might not have gone as far as she did. She was and still is the person to forgive and forget, or maybe she ultimately knew it had to be done, to push it to this point of no return before another family lost a member to these irresponsible neighbors. Either way, thank you, Margot, for making the world a little bit safer for the pets in the world. And rest in peace, Smokestack. Hopefully, I'll see you on the other side with your favorite orange sock and a can of tuna. The next one is a petty revenge story. I worked in an emergency room, ER, for 6 years, so I am full of stories, but when it comes to petty revenge, this one sticks out in my memory. P equals patient, PD equals patient's daughter, CP equals critical patient, me equals me. Every person who has worked in the ER knows that Mondays are the busiest days of the week and also when all the crazies come out. This day was no different. I worked as a nurse in triage, where you initially get assessed in the front before going to the back. Here we determine who needs to go back first and who can wait. It's not a first come, first serve as most people think. We had a few stretchers in the front for people who needed to be monitored a little closer or needed IVs, blood draws, labs. There were 6 stretchers, but this day was so busy, all 6 stretchers were filled, plus 5 more in the hallway. This lady comes in on an ambulance, but because her symptoms did not indicate an emergency, she was put in stretcher triage to wait her turn. She was in a lot of pain. After assessment, I recognized her symptoms as being caused by gallstones, painful but not life-threatening. We put her on a stretcher, started an IV, drew labs, and hooked her up to the monitor just in case. A few minutes later, PD comes in the front door. One look at her and we knew she would cause problems. She had everything from the shoes to the haircut. A classic rich Karen. When she saw that her mom was still in the front and hadn't seen a doctor yet, she started screaming that she knew the CEO of the hospital and that we would all be fired if we didn't get her mom back to see a doctor right now. We explained that her mom has a history of gallstones, and even P was saying that she has had this pain many times because of the gallstones. We explained about being really busy and that there were no rooms available in the back and we would get her back as soon as we could. She eventually calmed down but was still antsy. About an hour later, another patient, CP, comes in and was put in the stretcher beside P and PD. This patient had worrying complaints, but on initial assessment, we could not find anything wrong. Now, as a nurse, you learn to always trust your gut. When your gut sounds an alarm, you listen. Something about this patient was setting my alarm bells off, but all his vitals were normal, and I had no solid evidence to declare him an emergency. I hooked him up to the monitor and kept a very close eye on him. I let the charge nurse know of my concerns, and she said to let her know as soon as something changes. Not 5 minutes later, something changed. Now at this time, I should explain that this hospital was a level 1 trauma center, meaning we get all the bad cases from car crashes to gunshot victims. We were in the middle of gang territory. Since we had to be ready for any traumas, life-threatening injuries, we had a room with 3 beds that was closed off from the rest of the beds because traumas usually involved a lot of people and a lot of blood. Even on busy days like this one, those rooms were empty, unless there was a trauma patient. Now back to CP. I was taking vital signs of P when I looked over to CP. I noticed a worrying change in his rhythm and stopped with P to start assessing CP to see what was going on. That did not sit well with PD. She actually grabbed my arm and told me to finish with her mom. I jerked my arm free and said I had to make sure CP was okay. As I turned around to CP, his rhythm went into VVIB, a life-threatening rhythm. I called the charge nurse to inform her of CP's condition, all the while unhooking CP from the monitor and pushing his bed into drive. As I started pushing him back, PD actually jumped in front of the stretcher and stopped it. She was screaming that her mom was here first and needed to be seen before CP, and she was screaming that I was a liar and that she was going to get me fired. I'm usually a mild-tempered person, but knowing CP was literally minutes from dying, I said to PD, "You have a choice, get out of my way or get run over," as I started pushing the stretcher forward. Now I'm really good at pushing stretchers fast and getting the patients where they needed to go in a hurry, one of the reasons I was part of the trauma team. PD tried to stand firm, but she saw I wasn't going to stop and jumped out of the way just as I was an inch from hitting her. Unfortunately, she did not move fast enough and I ended up running over her foot. At this point, I didn't care and got the patient back to the trauma room, leaving PD screaming and lying on the floor. We spent about 30 minutes on CP, but he ended up dying. By the time I got back up front, P and PD had been taken to the back to see a doctor, but my charge nurse warned me that they were filing a complaint against me. A few days later, the actual CEO of the hospital came to visit me on my next shift. He was known to be a kind and fair man. Since this happened during a time before cameras were put in the ERs, he had to take what happened from word of mouth. Apparently, PD said I assaulted her several times and put her mom's life in danger by not assessing her properly and that I should be fired. Turned out that P did actually have gallstones and nothing else. Also, PD's foot was broken due to me running over it. I calmly explained exactly what happened, and that PD's actions might have ended up in CP dying because of the delay she caused by her actions. When I got to the part of what I said to PD and running over her foot, the CEO actually started laughing and then tried to cover his mouth to hide his laughter. He explained that PD was a friend of his sister and he knows what kind of person she is. Not only did I not get fired, but he put a personal note in my file praising my actions. On my next review, I got a large raise plus a bonus thanks to the CEO's note. The next one is an entitled People Story. A while back, I was dating this girl for roughly 2 years. I thought things were going great, but apparently, she was just dating me because she liked to tell people she was in a relationship. No, that's how it went with her. The way she described me was too immature, decent in bed, and honestly not worth the rest of my life. Those were the exact words she said to a friend of hers after we broke up. Anywho, I am getting ahead of myself. I went out and bought a ring, had this entire thing planned out to propose to her. However, she was suddenly not available for several weeks in a row. Well, my fears rang true as she suddenly showed up at my place one day. She acted like everything was normal as we talked, and she was grabbing everything that was hers. About halfway through, I just kind of looked at her and said, "Don't forget your hairdryer, it would be awkward to have to come back over after you dump me." This sparked a long and awkward conversation where she was fake crying. I had realized right then and there that I was an idiot. The way she acted, the way she spoke, and the way she treated me just screamed that she did not care. I was devastated, but seeing her made me angry. I had realized she was lying to me this entire time. About a month later, a friend of hers called me up and asked if she could come over to talk. I asked why, and she said my ex pissed her off, and she wanted to tell me some things. My mind went to horrifying things like she needs to warn me I need to see a doctor or things like that. Well, her friend came over, and we chatted for a while. Her friend was beyond pissed off, talking about ending the relationship pissed off at her. So her way to get back at her friend was to sleep with her ex-boyfriend. In my mental state, I said yes. More like I said, sure, yeah, we can do that if you really want to. So she ended up staying over for a few days as we got to talking about my ex. I told her about the ring, and she had the best idea to get back at my ex. Let's lay down in bed and post a pic of ourselves with the ring in between us. Yeah, I thought it was a terrible idea, but I wanted my ex to feel like crap, so, well, there you go. Not even 2 hours later, my ex was at the door. We posted the picture at like 11 a.m. and she was at my place at 12:40 something. Right off the bat, she tried to act like breaking up with me was a mistake. She said that I was the best boyfriend she ever had, and she was getting scared with how serious things were getting. She said she made a terrible mistake in breaking up with me. Well, her friend immediately went into a rant about my ex, saying that she was manipulative and that neither of us would believe this sob story she was giving. Gotta say, I'm very glad her friend was there because my stupid ass was believing my ex. I reminded her of how she treated me when she broke up and that she should go home. She was wasting her time. Well, now she brought up the ring. She said she owned it under the law, said that rings are gifts and that I cannot take it back. In unison, her friend and I said that I never gave it to her. We both looked at each other and laughed a bit as the absurdity of the situation was getting outrageous. She said she was owed that ring and that she was not leaving without it. At about this time, a police officer came up the stairs wanting to know what the trouble was. I guess we made enough noise that the neighbors called the police. The female officer asked what the situation was. Everyone tried to talk at once, and the officer shut us down. She pointed to my ex and asked her what the problem was. My ex said she was trying to pick up her stuff after we broke up. She asked me if it was true. I explained the situation, how my ex broke up with me before I had the chance to propose, and that she was never given the ring. Throughout the conversation, 2 more officers showed up, one a supervisor. The whole story was explained about 4 times. At one point, my ex said that the money from the ring would let her pay off her car. Have you ever seen a moment when someone says something so outrageous that everyone looks at them in utter disgust? I responded by saying that the ring isn't expensive. It was bought used off a website, and I reminded her that I am an IT tech. So this wasn't a ring that was 10-12K, more like 5K. The anger and rage that came over her face were immediately apparent to everyone. She stepped forward and punched me in the chest and kicked at me before being tackled to the ground by the female officer. The supervisor on the scene told us to go inside while they got her under control. We did, and about 10 minutes later, they came back. They wanted my statement. I told them I didn't want to press charges against her, but they said, yeah, it doesn't work like that. We saw it, so it's being processed. She ended up getting a misdemeanor offense for it. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.